In our last lesson, we were introduced to identifying and using supporting details within literary texts. In our second lesson of the module, we're going to spend some time looking at some different genres of literary texts and apply what we learned from lesson 1 to identifying specific details within a variety of literary works. Let's begin by looking at an example from the fantasy genre of literature. Fantasy writing typically involves a plot that is impossible to occur in the real world. Typically, the plot elements or the story elements are going to involve characters and actions and settings that may be very similar to what we would see in the real world, but there will be elements of sorcery and magic and creatures that are impossible to exist in our world. In this example, we have a snippet of a story called The Snipely House. So let's go ahead and look at this example and see if we can answer the question that we're asked to identify as we read the story. Like they do most weekends, Jiro and his sister Emmy are helping take care of Mr. Barone's yard. Suddenly, Jiro stops raking leaves and looks toward the bushes separating Mr. Barone's house from Ms. Snipely's. "There's that strange sound again, Emmy," he calls. "I don't hear anything," insists Emmy, pulling weeds. "I think you're trying to get out of raking." Suddenly, they both hear a loud, odd sound. "See," says Jiro. Emmy searches through the branches of the bushes. She can hear the creature chirping wildly, but its chirps sound like little roars. She pushes back the leaves and finds a tiny bird with the head of a lion. Its collar has gotten stuck on a branch. Jiro drops his rake. Mouths hanging open, he and Emmy stare at the creature. "What is it?" asks Jiro. "I don't know," says Emmy, "but it has a collar, so it's probably tame." She watches it struggling. "Aw, poor thing." So based on the story, which is most likely to happen next? Well, in this example, what we are asked to do is to make a prediction. So a prediction is an educated guess of something that is going to occur in the future. When we make a prediction, when we are reading, we're asking the question, what is going to happen? What do you think will happen next? Well, we can make predictions based on details within the story to help us determine what we think will happen. And as we learned in the last lesson, we will use our background knowledge and our personal experiences to help us make those predictions about what we think is going to occur. So, the question says, which is most likely to happen next? Emmy and Jiro will try to rescue the creature. Emmy and Jiro will leave the creature alone. Emmy will give the creature to Mr. Barone, or Emmy will help Jiro finish raking the yard. Well, let's take a look at the end of the passage once again. We see Emmy searches through the branches of the bushes. We hear the creature chirping. She pushes back the leaves and finds a tiny bird with the head of a lion. So Jiro drops his rake, their mouths drop open, and they stare. So what is it? Well, they're not sure. But Emmy points out that it has a collar, so it's probably tame. Then, here is where we need to focus. She watches it struggling. and then says all, poor thing. So based on these clues, what prediction can we make about what will most likely happen next? So our first option says Emmy and Jiro will try to rescue the creature. So based on past experience, previous knowledge, what do you think is going to happen? Well, obviously, even though they don't know what the creature is, they see that it's stuck. They see that it's struggling to get loose. And, of course, Emmy responds with, "Aw, poor thing." So, what would you do in this situation? Well, past experience and the knowledge that we have, even when dealing with dangerous creatures, we see that people will, out of compassion, try to help rescue the creature and get them free. So, in this case, Emmy and Jiro will try to rescue the creature. Seems like a good prediction. The next option, Emmy and Jiro will leave the creature alone. Well, at this point, we have some evidence that could lead us to think that, because they don't know what the creature is. They're shocked. They're dealing with something unknown. So, leaving the creature alone is also a potential option. Emmy will give the creature to Mr. Barone. Well, there's nothing really that we've encountered in this passage that would lead us to believe that that is a likely occurrence. So we can rule out that Emmy will give the creature back to Mr. Barone. And then finally, Emmy will help Jiro finish raking the yard. Maybe, but what's got their attention right now? Is it the fact that the yard needs to get finished raking? Or they need to finish raking the yard, or that they want to try to do something about this creature? Seems to me like raking the yard is the last thing on their mind, just based on what we see in this part of the passage. So with all of the evidence that we have been given, we can predict with confidence that, in fact, Emmy and Jiro are going to try to rescue the creature. So let's go down here and see if that is correct. So in our solution, the creature is stuck on a branch. Emmy says that it's probably tame and notices that it has a collar. So we already pointed out some of those details. So we can assume that it probably does belong to someone. It says, she also says, "All poor thing." This shows that she feels bad for the creature. So based on our details in the passage and our previous experience with something similar, even though we probably won't be rescuing a bird with a lion's head, we can safely predict and accurately predict that it's most likely that Emmy and Jiro are actually going to try to rescue the creature. The next genre of literary text that we will use as an example is what is called realistic fiction. We know that the term realistic means something that is believable, something that could happen. Realistic fiction is a genre of literary fiction that deals with topics and stories that could occur in the real world. So where fantasy kind of gets into these ideas of magic and sorcery and fantastic creatures, realistic fiction deals with people and animals and settings that occur in our world. In this example, we are going to be looking at the first 4 paragraphs of a story called What the Sams Found. So the question that we will be answering is, how does Sammy feel about the trip? So let's go ahead and look at the first 4 paragraphs, and keep in mind we are trying to look for clues and identify how Sammy might feel about taking this trip. Sammy's class was planning a field trip to the mountains to mine for gems. The day before the trip, Sammy kept telling his older brother about all the interesting rocks he thought he would find. "I bet I'll find an arrowhead," Sammy boasted to Leonard. "Nobody finds arrowheads, just boring old rocks," Leonard laughed. "Maybe people don't search carefully enough," Sammy replied. So, based on what we just read, let's see if we can identify how Sammy feels about the trip. But before we do that, what we are being asked to do is to make an inference. We have talked about inferences before, but an inference is simply an educated guess. So when we're asked to make an inference, we are going to make an educated guess based on details which we use as evidence to support something that isn't specifically stated by the author. So here, the author does not come out and tell us how Sammy feels about the trip, but based on the dialogue and based on the information that is presented to us in the passage, we can make a pretty good guess about how Sammy feels. So let's take a look at our options. He is sorry that his brother cannot come along. Well, in the passage, Sammy does mention his older brother. It says the day before the trip, Sammy kept telling his older brother about all the interesting rocks he thought he would find. So here is where it mentions Sammy's older brother, or Sammy's brother. And then the following paragraphs deal with their dialogue. Is there anything that is presented in the dialogue or in the opening paragraph that leads us to believe that his brother cannot come along? Well, there's nothing really that stands out other than it is Sammy's class that's going on the trip. And if the brother is older, most likely he is not in Sammy's class. But do we get any kind of a feeling based on the dialogue that maybe Sammy feels bad that his brother isn't coming? Well, there is nothing in the dialogue that would lead us to believe that. So we can rule that option out. The next one, he is sure that he will find something exciting. Well, if you look at paragraph 2, he says, "I bet I will find an arrowhead." And Sammy boasted. All right, so he's boasting. If we look closely, we can assume, or we can infer that he seems to be pretty excited. He also says, "I bet I'll find an arrowhead." So not a maybe, he's saying that he is certain. He's almost positive that he's going to find one. So this one is a possibility. Next, he is afraid of getting lost in the mountains. Well, he's excited about the possibility of finding an arrowhead. Not only that, when Leonard says nobody finds that, they only find boring old rocks, and he says maybe people don't search carefully enough. When we look at the dialogue and consider how Sammy does seem to be excited, do you really think that he's afraid of getting lost in the mountains? I don't get that sense when I read it, so I cannot, with confidence, make the claim, make the educated guess that he's afraid of getting lost. So we can rule that one out. And then finally, he is eager to ride on the bus with his best friend. While we do see in the dialogue that he does seem to be eager, what's he eager about? Well, paragraph 2, finding an arrowhead, finding something exciting. Does it say anything about him riding the bus with his best friend? There aren't even any clues that would lead us to believe that that's going to take place. So we can rule this one out as well. So based on the information, we can make the inference that Sammy is sure that he will find something exciting. In our next example passage, we are going to be using another type of fiction known as historical fiction. Now, historical fiction are stories and events that take place in the past. So it will have a historical setting, but the author may use made-up characters and even events that are set within a particular historic time period. Or they could also use real characters from history, real people from history, and just use their imagination to tell stories about things that they did. In this example, we're going to be looking at the first 2 paragraphs of where there's a will, there's a way. And as we read, we're going to be looking for details that show about education during the time that the story is set. So, as we look over these paragraphs, let's see what clues stick out to us to help us see what education was like during that time period. "Clean the press, Ben, then close the shop and take your half day off," said Mr. Wilcox. "I'm going out." "Yes, sir," Ben answered. As usual, he thanked his lucky stars that he was an apprentice at Mr. Wilcox's printing shop. He loved making books and even loved sleeping in the shop's attic because it meant waking up to the smell of ink. Apprentices were in hard training, so they weren't paid. Ben felt rich, though, because he could read all the books that the shop printed. And not many 15-year-olds knew as much as he did about the printing business. So let's look at our options to see if we can identify some clues to determine what education was like during that time period. So our first option, many teenage boys learned how to do jobs by working with adults. Well, we do have some clues that could make this a potential option. So we know that our main character, Ben, is 15 years old, where it says not many 15-year-olds knew as much as he did about the printing business. So based on this information, we can assume that Ben is 15 years old. So we know he's a teenager. And it talks about that he was an apprentice. And we learned that apprentices were in training, so they weren't paid. And he is working for Mr. Wilcox at a printing shop. So based on this information, that does seem like a possible option. So we will put a question mark there. Let's look at the other options. All children attended school until they were 18 years old. Based on the information in the story, is Ben in school? No. We're told he is an apprentice and he's working at a printing shop. He's 15 years old, which rules out that they're attending until they turn 18. So we can definitely rule that out. It was very rare for a teenage boy to know how to read. Is there anything in the passage that would support this? Well, what we're told is that Ben could read all the books that the shop printed. Okay, so he had access to every single book that they print. But does it say anything else about other teenage boys not knowing how to read? Based on the passage, we cannot make that claim. So there's nothing that seems to indicate that it was rare for a teenage boy to know how to read. And finally, boys and girls were taught the same things, but at different schools. Once again, we've already established the fact that they're not necessarily attending a school, but it is possible that boys or even girls could serve as an apprentice somewhere and learn different things. But they use the word school. So because of that, this option can be ruled out as well. So our first choice, many teenage boys learned how to do jobs by working with adults, seems to be the best inference, the best guess that we can make based on the information presented to us in the passage about how education worked during that time period. The last type of literary text that we are going to examine and use to practice identifying details is poetry. Now, I'm sure you're already thinking, oh, great, poems, really? Yes, we're going to look at a poem. Now, before we look at the example, there's a couple of things that we do need to mention just because it's going to help you be able to better identify those details. So first, we need to remember that poems don't always directly state what the author is trying to tell you. When you read, it's going to require some interpretation and a little bit of detective work on your part to see if you can determine what the author is actually trying to say. So, there's a couple of tips at least that I can provide for you to help you better identify what is being said as you are reading these poems. So, first, sometimes the details about the poem's characters or events are missing. So, when these events are missing, or maybe specific details about a character are missing, it's going to require you to make an inference. And we already talked about that just a few moments ago, that an inference is just simply an educated guess. So you may have to infer information about the character or about what's going on, as well as infer why it is taking place or why the character is doing a certain thing. There are going to be other times that poems might use unusual words or phrases to describe something. Anytime this is done, they are using language that is called figures of speech. Some examples of figures of speech would be things like simile, metaphor, personification, And those are three of the most common ones that you will encounter in a poem. Simile is making a comparison between two different things using like or as. Metaphor is also making a comparison, but it's a little bit more of a direct comparison of two unlike things. Anytime that you see a metaphor, it doesn't use like or as. For example, with a simile, I am as hungry as a horse. So I am as hungry as a horse. So my hunger is being compared to the hunger of a horse. Now, if I make the statement, I am a hungry horse, obviously I'm not a horse, but what I'm doing is I am using a metaphor to compare my hunger to a horse's hunger. Personification, of course, is giving human-like qualities to objects or things that are not human. The trees danced in the wind. Obviously, trees don't dance, but because the wind is causing the trees to sway back and forth, it does kind of look like dance, and that's what comes to mind. So that would be an example of personification. Finally, making inferences and understanding figures of speech will also help you understand a poem's theme. We're not going to get into too much detail about what theme is because we're going to be looking at that more in depth in a future lesson. But for the purposes of what we are doing with this particular assignment, the theme is just simply the main message that the author wants you to take away from the poem. So theme is sort of like the main idea or the main thing that the author is saying, specifically within literary texts. So let's take a look at the poem Diamond Necklace. In the market's parking lot, something shines right by my spot. I spy a diamond on a chain. I fly off with it like a jet plane. I explain to the store clerk, who gives a grin, the diamond's owner just came back in. She left it here, and I know that she will thank you for your honesty. She gushes to me what it meant. The necklace was a dear present. She presses something in my hand. A bill stares at me, crisp and grand. So in this poem, we're told that the bolded text shows a simile, which compares two things using like or as. So here, I fly off with it like a jet plane. So what exactly is that statement saying? Well, the person has just grabbed a diamond on a chain that they found laying outside. And it says they flew off with it like a jet plane. Well, did the person actually fly? No, it has nothing to do with flying. But the person did take off running. And the comparison that's being made here is like a jet plane. So when we think of jet planes move very fast. So the person ran off with this diamond, or ran back into the store with this diamond rather quickly. So it says that the bolded text shows a simile which compares two things using like or as. What is the purpose of this text? So the first option, it shows that the narrator decides to take the necklace on a plane. Well, we've already established that the comparison that was made doesn't really have anything to do with getting on a plane, so we know that that is not a potential option. So we're going to go ahead and rule it out. It signals that the narrator hurries back to the market with the necklace. Well, we do know that that is the case because we compared the person running off with the speed of a jet plane. So, of the three, we do know that is correct. The last one, it suggests that the necklace is almost as expensive as a jet plane. Nothing in the text really stands out about just how expensive the diamond was. We do know that diamonds are expensive, but there's nothing in the text that really puts us in a price range on how much it costs. We also know jet planes are expensive. Could the diamond be just as expensive as a jet plane? Maybe, but nothing in this text will really indicate that that is the case. So we can rule out the last option as well. So the bolded text is a simile that signals to us that the narrator is hurrying quickly back into the market with the necklace.